Now look, making straight, perfect 90-degree cuts every single time has never been easier thanks to this awesome little homemade gadget, the Uncle Knacker's approved SS1000. Simply mark where you want to cut and then line the edge of the SS1000 up to that mark. Then just simply place the saw on top of the jig with the edge of the shoe hard up against the rail, and away you go. Now check that out, a beautiful square cut, and to top it off you can use the SS1000 to cut wide material cleanly as well as perfectly straight. Winner winner, chicken dinner. And there you have it. How simple was that? Perfect cuts every single time. Now if you'd like to make yourself one of these awesome SS1000s, do yourself a favour and check out the link to the plans down beneath this video. G'day folks, Uncle Knackers here with a selection of tips and tricks on how to use your circular saw safely and more effectively, which I've resurfaced from Module 5 in my Circular Saw for Beginners Masterclass. Now make sure you stick around for the last tip because it's an absolute little ripper. Interesting. Welcome to Module 5 folks, which is where we are actually going to get our hands dirty and I'm going to show you how to use the circular saw. Now the first thing you need to ask yourself is, what are you cutting and what type of finish are you after? And that will determine which blade you use. For example, am I after a fast, quick, just get it done cut, or am I after a smooth, clean cut with minimal splintering? And you can refer back to Module 3 to freshen up your memory on those blade selection details. Secondly, to protect yourself from potential injury, make sure you have the appropriate safety gear on hand, such as safety glasses, a set of earmuffs, and a dust mask. And thirdly, keep in mind that to cut squarely, especially when you're first starting out and you don't have much experience under your belt, when making a cut, you need to have the wider side of the base plate, which is where the motor sits over, riding on the piece of material that you are keeping and not on the side of the waste piece. Let me demonstrate. This is the line that we want to cut. This side of the line is the piece that we want to keep, and this side of the line is the waste or the offcut. Now if we place the saw with the wide part of that base plate over the piece that we want to keep, the weight of the saw with the motor will help keep the saw flat, which will then produce a nice square cut. Now on the other hand, if you are cutting with the wide section of that base plate over the waste section of that line, you'll notice that the base plate over here doesn't have any support. So what happens then is that as you're making your way through the cut, the weight of that motor will tend to tilt the saw or the blade, and you'll finish up with a cut that is most likely not 90 degrees or square to the piece that you want to keep. Okay, just two more quick things before you take the plunge and make that cut. Make sure you set the blade about 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch deeper than the wood that you are cutting. That way there's less chance of the blade binding, causing the saw to kick back, which can be a spine-tingling experience to say the least. Secondly, to gain more control over your cut and also to avoid a potential injury, it's always a good idea to clamp down the material that you're about to cut. It only takes a couple of seconds to set up and you'll finish up with a better result. Now to ensure that you start your cut on the right foot, it's a good idea to line the blade of the saw up with the mark that you're about to cut before you start the saw. Now an easy way for us to do that is to line the 0 indicator mark, which you will find on the front of the base plate, up with our pencil line. Now the reason for that is that the 0 indicator mark actually lines up with the blade on the saw, so in effect it acts as a guide for us to follow. Once you're feeling comfortable, the cords are out of the way and you have both hands on the saw, pull in that trigger, wait till the blade gets up to full speed and then commence the cut. Don't rush it and just let the saw do the work and make sure that you are cutting on the side of the pencil line that you don't want. and to avoid any potential accidents, wait till the blade stops spinning before you remove it and then place it down. One very important thing to be aware of when using a circular saw is make sure that the end of the board or the waste piece can fall freely away from the point of support, as that will prevent the blade from binding, which can cause heart-stopping kickback, and you don't want that. Just be aware though, as you're nearing the completion of your cut and gravity starts to take hold, this waste piece, as it's falling away from the good piece, can cause a bit of splintering on the underside here, which is fine if you're doing a bit of rough carpentry, like house framing for example. Now if you're cutting material for a nicer project and you want to avoid that splintering from occurring, fully support the board by placing some timber beneath it along its entire length, which will stop the offcut from falling to the ground and prevent that potential splintering from happening. Another great way to fully support the board that we are cutting is to use some of this hard foam paneling. This sheet is 50mm or 2 inches thick, and this is going to fully support this sheet of plywood that I'm about to cut, which means that the offcut isn't going to fall away to the ground, which means that we should finish up with little to no splintering. Beautiful. Very nice. Now this next point that I'm about to discuss is very important to your safety, so please take note. Now I've mentioned this word a couple of times earlier in this video, and that word relates to the term binding. And the most common cause of binding is cutting a board in the middle that is only being supported on either end. What happens is as you near the completion of your cut, the wood bends down and closes in on the blade, causing it to bind or jam, which in turn causes the saw to kick back uncontrollably, which can often lead to unexpected injury, and the timber, also more times than not, will be damaged in the process. So the lesson is, never cut a board in the middle that is only being supported on either end. It's a recipe for disaster. Speaking about lessons, how's this? I've been taking my golf game pretty seriously over the last couple of months, having 2 lessons per week, and I think it's really starting to pay off. For instance, yesterday I shot a 67, which I thought was pretty good, and then on the second hole I shot a 48. So, things are looking pretty good. Onwards and upwards, I always say. Gotta love golf. If you find yourself having to make an angled cut, you might realise that the saw guard can actually cause a few problems. The reason being is that when you cut on an angle, the guard hits the wood first, which tends to make the saw want to wander or even bind, and you don't want that to happen. So to prevent that, prior to the cut, retract that guard and then line the blade up with our mark. Start the motor, enter the cut by about 1.5 inches, then release that guard and continue cutting. Now if you need to cut a 45-degree bevel along a straight line, which is a very common cut by the way, once you've set your saw to a 45-degree bevel, the principle is the same as our previous angled cut, whereby you retract the guard prior to entering the cut, and then instead of lining the front of the base plate up to the 0-degree mark, you move it across to the 45-degree mark, and away you go. Too easy. Now this next tip is an absolute little ripper, because let's face it, there's times when you're cutting sheet goods that you just wish you had a second pair of hands to stop the offcut from falling down to the ground or binding on the blade while you're using your saw, which is where this little homemade gadget made from scraps comes in very handy, and I'll show you how to use it. First of all, if you have one, clamp on a straight edge of some description, which will help you cut a straight line. And then start the saw and enter the cut by about a foot or 300 millimeters, and then stop the saw. Next, go ahead and just simply slip the second pair of hands gadget over the edge of both pieces, which will safely hold the sheet good in place as you restart the saw and finish the cut. The blade won't bind and you won't damage the sheet. Love it. Now for more awesome circular saw content, do yourself a favour and check these videos out next.